Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I just want to applaud you for holding these hearings. I think they're probably, if not the most important, some of the most important hearings we're holding in this Congress. I want to thank the witnesses for solid testimony and solid recommendations. It's interesting, I met with Dr. Patrick Soon-Shiung yesterday, a man of incredible accomplishment, but one of the things he did, he's the founder of American Pharmaceutical Partners. I mentioned this hearing. He said, well, that's similar to what happened in 2008 with heparin. This is not a new issue. We had contaminated heparin back in 2008 coming from China. It was on purpose. It was contaminated with a cheaper ingredient that could not be detected by normal measurements. And I see one of our witnesses shaking their head, but I'll ask you about it, but I'd like to enter into the record. I've got a white paper, I think, written by APP, one by the American Health and Drug Benefits, and then one from the Science Direct, European Journal of Pharmaceutical Sciences, which talk about this. But Mr. Kuko, you were shaking your head. Describe this. Again, this is nothing new. This happened in 2008, and here we are in 2025. We're describing the same problem which we have not addressed.
No, you're exactly correct, Senator. In 2007, 2008, somebody in China figured out how they could spoof the standard test for the active ingredient in heparin. They did so for economic reasons. We call it economically motivated adulteration. And they sold defective drug into the United States. That led to a kind of realization about how dependent we are on those foreign supply chains. FDA was given new authorities. The inspectional framework was rejiggered. But structurally,
we solved the problem, right? We fixed it.
Structurally, we are still headed in the wrong direction. We actually have heparin with U.S. API. Most of the heparin comes originally from the intestinal mucosa of pigs. China has a big pork herd, and most of the world's heparin comes from China. We have heparin API from the U.S., but it's more expensive than the Chinese heparin. So, if we're going to fix the problem, we have to sort of be willing to source from the U.S.
So let's talk, because I want to go back to the precursor chemicals, a new term I have, the key starting materials. Is that the same thing?
Yeah, so precursor chemicals, even going back all the way to petrochemicals, are the chemical starting materials that feed into the intermediates and ultimately the active pharmaceutical ingredients.
How many of those key starting materials, precursor chemicals, are there? Are we talking about hundreds, or are we talking about a few dozen?
No, thousands, and they are, the majority are made in China.
And that's a refining process.
Correct.
They're literally thousands. Are there a smaller batch of kind of general categories and then specific types within those categories?
I think it's important to note for this committee, and thank you, Senator, for raising this, that there are thousands of drugs in our supply chain themselves. And it is really critical for us as a nation to prioritize. We must focus. We cannot boil the ocean. We must secure our industrial base, focusing on those critical essential medicines that are prioritized by criticality, vulnerability, and reach. And so I would say there is a smaller subset that we can identify linked to a smaller group of active ingredients that are necessary to sustain the health of our population, because there are some medicines that have no therapeutic alternative and others where we're not as concerned about the supply chain failing because alternatives are readily available.
But, so one of the key precursor chemicals is oil itself, correct? But then we have plant-based. Would that be considered, things that are extracted from plants or from bacteria or from algae or from what? Can you just describe that chain, starting from the most basic all the way up to API and then to the final drugs?
Sure. Certain key starting materials are derived from the petrochemical industry. Some, ironically, are derived from the rare earth mineral industry. There's a connection there. Some of these starting materials are synthesized to create solvents or reagents like toluene or benzene that we require in order to manufacture these active ingredients. Still others can be built leveraging synthetic biology, to your point, Senator. For example, one of our active pharmaceutical ingredients where we could not source the key starting material in any domestic location, we partnered with a company to leverage a synthetic biology approach or fermentation to help actually manufacture that starting material, which is one way to do it more cost competitively. So across the spectrum, there's a variety of chemical sources. Some are synthetically derived, some are biotechnologically derived. Regardless, it starts with mapping and knowing where they're coming from and focusing and prioritizing in order to ensure that we get a start somewhere.
So if I could just real quick, Mr. Chairman, I want to go to quick Tom Neely. What are your raw materials? Because you said you wanted to create the capability to produce API. So your raw materials are still API from where?
Well, the one I'm speaking of comes from China. Of the 13 product families that we produce, 2 come from China, and everyone else comes from outside the United States, but it's Europe mainly.
But again, because you're compounding these things or you're turning them into drugs, probably have a greater sense of quality control, unless they're doing something like they did with the heparin, where they disguise the adulteration.
To me, it's all about vertical integration and the synergies you get from vertical integration. If you are able to build an API plant right next to a manufacturing plant, you're going to have some cost saves.
Okay.
And that's what it's going to take because China is so cheap.
Well, again, my guess, I know, Mr. Chairman, you're all over this, is we require labeling to know exactly where not just the API comes from, but the precursor chemicals. I think that will radically change because people will demand complete U.S. supply chain for their drugs. They'll demand it, and they'll pay a higher price. And by the way, drugs are not, particularly generic drugs, are not that high a spend in terms of our overall medical bill, price tag. So,
Senator Johnson, you're hitting the nail on the head because if I'm buying an API from Europe, for example, but they're getting their precursor from China, defeats the purpose.
right. Well, thank you, witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member Gillibrand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.